What is up, and welcome back to the Bridge the Gap podcast with Oliver and Zach. This is the show where we bridge the gaps between spirituality, science, heart, mind, and thoughts and feelings in the different sectors of society. Today we are joined with Andrew Murnane and Ray, who have built a community, and there's so many different words you could use, but they have their project called Dualistic Unity, which I would love for them to explain it better than I could, but it's a very, very cool movement that I think they're putting together, bringing people together and kind of just trying to navigate the spiritual world and make it possible for us to be in unity with one another in the best way possible. So welcome, guys. It's good to have you, and feel free to introduce yourself and tell the audience more about Dualistic Unity and what that's all about.
All right. How's it going, Oliver and Zach? Great to be here. Great to see you guys. My name's Andrew, and I'll just give a quick little spiel about Dualistic Unity. So kind of sometimes I mix up the ways that I explain to people what the podcast is about, because sometimes it's not always the most, straightforward way of going about it. But what I've been using recently is the recognition that you are never what you think you are. It's kind of the core. And I think there's a bunch of ways that people can take that and go with it. But the title, the name of it kind of speaks for itself. Dualistic Unity is more or less the recognition that all of this is unified, one mind expressed infinitely. There is no actual inherent division in all of reality, but we have the experience of duality, this dualistic experience. That where we perceive a division between you and me that is perpetuated by the concepts, labels, identities that we cling to, which aren't a bad thing, but something to, the more lightly you take it, typically the less suffering you experience in your life. And oftentimes getting too caught up in taking those concepts and that division to be the truth leads to excessive suffering that you don't experience as much when you recognize that it may not be as real as you think. So with that, I'll pass it off to Ray.
As mentioned, I'm Ray. I don't know if I had to summarize Dualistic Unity, I think it would be about the conversation itself, keeping in mind that there are numerous pitfalls along the journey to self-awareness. There are numerous people who will say, I have the answer, just hold on to this and you'll be fine. And there's so much false certainty on that path. And I've been on this path for so very long, and I've gone down so many of those little side trails and come back afterwards to recognize that there are consistent problems that relate to the identity. There are consistent traps on the journey. And if you don't keep that in mind, you end up getting confused and running around in circles until you finally do get that sense of clarity again. And so if I had to say anything, I would say Dualistic Unity is really about discussing existence without getting caught on anything. If anything, it is the practice of not getting caught on anything and just enjoying the conversation. And I think as we've gone along and now we're in season 4, what we've noticed is that there are a lot of people who want to have this conversation, and some of them have gotten caught up in things and some of them have not yet. And so there is this collective effort to help one another not get caught up, and it's transformed my life. And I know Andrew's experienced a lot of insight on his own from the community. Most of our podcast episodes are actually reinforced and taught to us by the community. It's more coming from them than us at this point.
Awesome. And, I've checked out your guys' stuff. I've watched some podcast episodes, which I really enjoy them. Me and my partner both were listening to some this morning. And what I'm curious of that I didn't hear anything about, or not too much about, was your guys' personal stories of where this awakening started. I imagine you guys somewhere along the journey discovered the idea of questioning everything, which is something you guys talk about a lot. And I know for me, since I was like 5 years old, my dad kind of gifted me that way, which caused a lot of problems with me with teachers growing up. But I think at the end of the day was very worthwhile. But I'm very curious to hear about your personal stories. And Zach, if there's anything you wanted to pop in before that, feel free.
Yeah, actually, we're very interested in hearing like your awakening stories and how you've integrated that into your daily life. And, I was really excited to listen to your guys' podcast. And Andrew, you had even brought up this notion of going into Dolores Cannon's material initially and then being like, I don't know if that's a fit for me, right? And so I think Oliver and I can relate to that a lot. And like this whole podcast is built around the notion of bridging the gap. And so many of us have kind of reached these states of higher consciousness in terms of understanding what oneness is, understanding kind of the non-dualistic aspect of reality, but we're here having an experience of duality in some aspect. And so how do we take these heightened states and ground it in to our everyday life? Like, what does that look like? For many of us, we do still need kind of a sense of self and identity, right? And so, I mean, even Ray, you brought up this notion of, well, is there sanity, insanity? I mean, these are really great conversations to explore, because an awakening of itself can feel insane. And so where do we ground that? Where do we find that normalcy? How does this help us still pay our car insurance on time? Do we need to pay our car insurance on time? So just kind of wanted to open a space up on like how you've had your awakening journeys and how that has intersected and related to your own life and relationships.
All right, let's get going. I mean, this is pretty much what we talk about nonstop every single week, is all of the things that both of you brought up. Got a couple notes here of like where to kind of go with all of this, but I'll start with just some of my background. So Oliver, you mentioned questioning things from a young age. Honestly, I didn't have that much of that experience. I was very much like caught in the blueprint of doing things. I didn't question a ton. I grew up in not the most uncomfortable environment in the world, like upper middle class family, kind of lived a pretty comfortable life, but through high school started experiencing more social anxiety, a lot of concern about what people thought of me. And that is kind of what a lot of my content is based around, just things that I've learned to help overcome that. I won't get too deep into those things, but I basically used to care a lot about what people thought, and it was crippling. It made me very, very quiet throughout high school, through college, and a couple years after college, started recognizing ways to not experience all of those things as much, or at least not be so resistant to them as they arise, which is basically what everything's come down to for me, is not thinking that anything I'm going through is wrong or bad. And then it was about a year and a half ago now, I was on a walk through New York and kind of going through a tougher week, just dealing with a lot of internal suffering, basically worrying about things that had happened in the past, fearing they're going to happen again in the future. And I was going through my like gauntlet of positivity affirmations, gratitude, all of these sort of, I call them now identity-based practices that, and none of them were helping. They had always helped me in the past. One of them hit and helped me work through things. And so I was on a walk through New York, and I was listening to an audiobook, and it mentioned something about how the past doesn't actually exist. You know, it only exists inside of your mind. And that's something I'd made videos about. I'd probably made 100 videos about that recognition, but it hit me in a different way that day. And I was able to imagine, you know, what if I didn't have a past? What if I was just dropped into reality in this very moment right now? And it was a very freeing, kind of euphoric feeling. And I kind of kept going with it and recognized that the whole idea of Andrew that I was worrying about, that kind of was the root of all of my suffering, was all rooted in the past. And so if my past wasn't as real as I thought that it was, if I had only ever experienced here and now, and that was kind of the extent of the reality of what I was, maybe that idea of Andrew wasn't actually what I was either. And so kind of settled on the recognition that I'm the awareness of Andrew. And since then have peeled back even more of those things that I settled upon. Big credit to Ray and just the conversations that we have, getting me to go dig even deeper into all of it. And since then, been a lot of up and downs. And, you know, there was that day, that sort of experience that I had. But in terms of awakening, I don't see it as a one-time thing. You know, people talk about ego death and all of that, and say I had an ego death, and it's like one of the most egotistical things you can ever really say. And people get attached to that. So I see, you know, awakening is kind of like an every moment sort of thing, a letting go of all of those identities, things you believe to be the truth. And I know, Zach, you had a couple questions about like Dolores Cannon, staying grounded in all of this. I definitely want to get into all of that, but I'll pass it over to Ray to introduce himself a little bit more before then.
I don't even know where to start. I definitely don't want to I don't want to drop the mood for everyone here. And so I'm going to
No,
cherry
actually,
pick
man,
a little
vulnerability is a
bit.
big part of what we do. In our
And
intro episode, we went right into our own personal traumas and everything. We're actually trauma informed coaches and healers, so we love this stuff. This is our life's work, and we think it's really important for just the human journey to recognize, acknowledge, and to transcend. So go ahead, please.
Fair enough. Okay. Nonetheless, Cole's Notes version. I don't know if you guys know what Cole's Notes is. I'm old. Go with me. Anyway, summarized. I was unfortunately born into a world where nobody really wanted me. Like, my parents had me for a very specific reason. And when that reason didn't turn out for them, they realized, well, we don't really need this anymore. And so I was more or less just cast into the world. And I was picked up by my grandparents for a little while. And then afterwards I moved back in with somebody. And over the course of the next few years went through hell and then ran away and then continued to be on my own for the rest of my teenage years going into my 20s. And there was a lot of hardship that was going through that. But regardless of the external, regardless of any of the details of the story, I think the overarching problem was the fact that I was really invested in the idea of myself. That was what was weighing me down the entire time. Not so much what I was going through, so much as how I thought it defined me, how I was holding on to it as a narrative, as proof of my value and my worth and my ability to be loved at all. And so as my life went on, regardless if there were good moments or not, I almost couldn't see them because I was holding on to everything that was dragging me down. And it just continued to spiral. And so no matter how many different directions I went in terms of trying to find a bigger, better idea of myself, whether that be the popular person or the person who's good at business or the person who's good at school or any of those things, the partier, any of those personas, I invested in all of them. We talk about spirituality. I invested in so many different belief systems, just trying to be something that was going to set me free of this suffering that I didn't recognize I was carrying with me each and every moment because I thought I was the idea of myself. And so that dragged me down repeatedly. I often joke that I hit rock bottom so often I set up a cot there. So if anybody hits rock bottom, look out for the cot. You'll see evidence of me. But it was just like that every day. I loathed everything about my existence for what seemed like an eternity. I would go to work and I would think about jumping in front of the bus or off the bridge. It was all the time. And so I self-admitted, I tried to commit suicide. I realized, well, that's not the way that I want to go, because God, there has to be something about all this shit I've been through. I don't know if I can swear on here, about all this stuff I've been through that I can use at the very least. And that didn't make any sense to me for a long time. And then one day I was sitting at home with my roommate and I was spiraling downwards because I was still smacking my face on rock bottom. And he asked me, like, you never talk about life anymore? Like, because I used to try and figure this out. Despite my suffering, there was still some of me in there trying to surface. And nobody really cares. I was really spiraling. And then it dawned on me. And I think it was the first time it dawned on me forever that why did it matter if nobody cares? Why didn't I care? Why didn't it come back down to me? And I went, oh, I've been carrying this with me. And I realized I had always been living for my place in the story of humanity as I perceived it, like how I was supposed to fit in with the family dynamic and how that made me fit in with society and its values and how that put me in the hierarchy. It didn't help that I was raised Roman Catholic, where, of course, being born out of wedlock and all that, you're the black sheep and there's so much judgment there. You're going to hell. You're going to hell. And so all of a sudden, it was like there was this giant golden doorway in the middle of my mind that's like freedom. And it was just realizing I was never what I thought it was, that it was all just an idea I continued to carry because it was somehow preferable to me not knowing who I was. Like I was holding on to false certainty for the sake of avoiding uncertainty. So I was holding on to hell because I was afraid of freedom. And that's what dawned on me. And that was the day my life changed. It was very much that day that I just recognized I could put down the story. And it changed my life so much that I've spent every day since then trying to figure out how to communicate that.
That's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing. I'm curious because I know for me, I also can very much relate when you were in that period of all you could think about was wanting to jump in front of a bus and every day was living hell. I can relate. And I had that in my life too. For me, when I had my moment of awakening, yes, you could say, it took a long time before I started to feel any better. Right. So I'm also curious to just a little bit more about that. Like you had that golden door moment, which is amazing. It's beautiful. But talk about from everything you've been through, that takes a lot of integration, a lot of work. So if you could, briefly, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, like about that part of the journey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've never lost sight of that hell, as you can tell from the way I describe it. It's always clearly visible within my awareness. I remember very much what it's like to not know who I am and to feel disconnected from everything. And so once I had that breath of air, because it really was, it felt like coming up for air after drowning and suffocating in it. That was all I needed. Then it was like, okay, there's air. How do I get there? And yeah, I'd continue to drop back down, but that's when I started developing tools. Like I would start journaling all the time just to have a dialogue with myself, because I knew talking to other people about this wasn't necessarily going to fly all the time because they have their own stuff to worry about. And that's another thing that became abundantly clear. Oh my God, everybody's doing this. Yeah. Empathy hits you straight in the face, right? All of a sudden, it's not, what can I get out of people? How can they help me? But, oh, how can I make this easier on you? And everything changed as a result of that. But I ended up developing what I call my holy trinity. We actually did a whole episode on about this on the podcast. And basically, it's just relax, pay attention, and be yourself. Depending what you're going through, one of those is going to resonate. Not all of them, but one of them, depending what situation you're in. And that's the one that leads you to the other two, because they all mean the same thing. They all bring you back to a state of presence, getting out of your head, as it were, right? And so that was what I kept pounding on, that and need. Every time I get lost in thought, every time I'd start doing that inner analysis, I go, what am I trying to satisfy here? Am I trying to feel better? Am I trying to feel in control? Am I trying to feel like I know? And it was always just like, what need am I satisfying? And as soon as I'd recognize it, I'd stop. It's like, that's where it comes from. And it would make sense. And so, yeah, that was a 24/7 dialogue with myself for so very long. And sorry, I'm going to continue babbling for a second, Andrew, apologies. I went like that for about 4.5 years. It was about 3 years before I ended up meeting the girl who is now my wife. And then about 1.5 years later, I was at a point where I needed to integrate this so much that I told her, I'm sorry, it's been fun. I'd love to stay with you, but I need to leave and I need to go to the forest and I need to abandon everything. And so I did. And she came with me and we sold everything we owned and we grabbed a bunch of 2 backpacks and we went out into the middle of the rainforest on Vancouver Island. And we lived in a shack that we built ourselves for 8 months, where we lived off mussels on the beach and dandelion salad. And we did pretty much everything we could just to not starve to death. And in that time, I solidified the recognition. I don't need anything but me. There's nothing I need except this moment to feel complete and whole. And that hammered that in so much deeper than anything else. And then I came back to the world figuring there's no way to change the ripple if you're not rippling with everybody else. And so here I am.
And I think that's such an amazing part of your story too. And I think that's like the fantasy moment that like all of us have. We're like, you know what, I'm just going to sell everything and move to the forest and just like be with God and just, do that thing. And then nobody does, but you actually did. So props to you. And that sounds very just, it's hard to find words for it, right? Because that just sounds very profound, but amazing. But I'll open the floor to anybody who wants to share or to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can start getting into some of Zach's other questions as well regarding some of my ins and outs, and Ray can touch on these because he's been in and out of way more spiritual practices or sort of side quests on the journey nowhere, more or less. But yeah, regarding Dolores Cannon, I think something we're very careful of is not to ever say that anyone should do anything. Like, it's really not about giving someone the answer. I find that the continued process of questioning is significantly more important than, finding an answer, because anytime you settle upon an answer, it's something that is known, seems certain, but in an inherently uncertain reality, there are no answers to settle upon. It's all nuance. It's all gray area. There isn't nearly as much black and white as we perceive there to be when we settle upon these things. And so when it comes to someone like Dolores Cannon or any spiritual snake oil salesman, they're usually the ones giving you an answer. They're telling you this is how it is. This is the way it is. In Dolores Cannon's case, before you come here, you sign a soul contract, and everything you go through is things that you had contracted before your life. And to someone going through the shit, like, it can sound really nice. It can sound like very profound, like, oh, this thing I'm going through, I chose it. But it's really just another narrative. It's another story. It's another sort of belief system that gives you a false sense of certainty that doesn't actually allow you to be free. Like, as much as these things may help you, it's not to say that there isn't, it's all objectively harmful. It's not by any means, but there are pitfalls to all of them. And there are other degrees of prison, more or less. And anytime you settle upon a false certainty, a certainty about yourself, it becomes another prison, because it causes you to be resistant to the flow of the way that reality is, which is constantly uncertain. And if you imagine it kind of like a great analogy that a lot of people use, or like a river. If life is like a river, settling upon an answer is like clinging to the side of the river, being like, no, this is it. It's like reality's continuing on, and you're settling upon this thing that isn't actually in that flow. It's just settling upon something that gives you a false sense of certainty that doesn't actually soothe. It kind of soothes your fear temporarily, but creates a number of other fears and issues along the way. And so I think it's important to just continue to question the things that you settle upon, because again, as soon as you settle upon something, it forces you to defend it. Someone comes along and questions that, what if that isn't it? And you may feel some internal type resistance to them, or it kind of causes you to cling to it, as opposed to just continuing to have the conversation. And as Ray said, if dualistic unity is anything, it's just a continued conversation. And that's part of the reason we find it to be very important to kind of push the edges of what people think dualistic unity is, kind of get people a little bit uncomfortable, because any idea you settle upon, anyone in the dualistic unity community knows this, like any idea of dualistic unity that you settle upon isn't the reality of what it is, because it's an ever flowing thing, just like reality. So when people settle upon it, and then we go out and, rile people up in some way, shape, or form, questioning some identity, be it religion, nationalism, gender identity, any of the things that we settle upon for a false sense of certainty, if that's something that a lot of people have a lot of pushback about, it may make them uncomfortable, because they have an idea of dualistic unity being like, these positive guys trying to help people. And it's like, even that isn't the reality of what it is. Like there's a time and a place for everything in every conversation. And so that's why I see the people who are coming to you, telling you the truth, telling you what the answer is, just to be very, very hesitant and careful about settling upon them, or anyone who's telling you to follow them to freedom, because following someone takes you further from freedom. Freedom can really only be found within yourself. And so as much as we appreciate everyone in our community, we tell them over and over, like, you do not need us. You do not need the podcast. Anything that this resonates with for you is not on us. That's on you. Communication is a two-way street. Insight is a two-way street. Clarity is very much a two-way street, if not just a one-way street within yourself. So yeah, in regards to all of the spiritual snake oil salesmen, just be very mindful of people who come around trying to tell you the right way to live or what the truth is.
So I hope you don't mind me chiming in, because I love what you guys had said. And for Ray, it really feels like you kind of went through the hero's journey in a way, right? Like you had to descend into the underworld. You're like, fuck it, detach everything, right? Bringing the partner with me, and we're just going to see, I'm going to starve. And you came back with this awareness out of it. It's like descending into the underworld and coming out, right? And so then there's this notion of, suffering sometimes propels us to these awakened states. Do we need suffering? But one thing I actually want to go in further on that you guys have brought up in one of your earliest episodes was this notion, and this is a big one to explore. Is there a right versus wrong? And where is the fine line between God? This is right perfect in the whole concept of non-duality or dualism. And Andrew, you brought up this concept of, it does feel like Dolores Cannon is doing something a little snake oil, which kind of could be delineated as wrong. And I see in this space, right, but we're attaching meanings, we're attaching words, right? But I see in the spiritual wellness space, and what we're trying to bridge the gap with is, there is spiritual abuse going on. There is, I see that sometimes there are these guru complexes, and it can lead someone to where their entire power is taken from them. They think they have to be completely reliant upon someone. And I think we're trying to find, and maybe these words aren't the right words, but is there a little bit of a this nuance of, there sometimes is a wrong way to do something maybe on this path, like, or is there a right way, or is it all just perspective and from pulling out? Like, how do you guys look at this type of questioning?
I'm going to throw in on this one quickly. I think, as you said, the words kind of get in the way. I think we tend to rely on words like good, bad, right, and wrong because they're overly simplistic. But if we break it down to what we mean, more often than not, it's what we like or don't like. Like, we can break things down to constructive or destructive. We can recognize that. We can recognize this is something that's building something or growing something, and this is something that's destroying something. But to break it down to right or wrong or good or bad makes it and more of a moral argument, more about us than anything else, right? And so, like a forest fire is terrible until it provides new growth after the fact. And so that changes things. And so in the same way, when we're talking about spirituality, I think it's important to recognize what we're talking about in spirituality, because the path of spirituality is ultimately the path of surrender. The more you surrender, the further into the flow you get, the more insights you have, the clearer you are. You start to realize there's a timing to everything, that we're not disconnected, and it all comes to you. It's not a belief. It's not something that you need to be talking about. It's something that starts to unfold as you, through you, in your awareness, however you'd like to put it. And so if we're looking at the spiritual path, there are no levels, but there are certainly directions. There are two towards that state of being and away from that state of being. And the same is true for spiritual snake oil. It's not that what they're doing is wrong. It's that it's riddled with selfishness. It's that there is still that need to satisfy the self, and almost the temptation to have the other people satisfy themselves with a narrative, with that false certainty that ultimately leads them to being disillusioned. And that's the problem. I've had so many clients over the last 10 to 15 years that paid tens of thousands of dollars to these people just to end up back in the same doubt and fear. And why? Because they kept trying to say, this is the answer. This is the story. This is what you have to hold on to. This is what you have to believe. This is what you have to practice. All of that works in a temporary sense until it doesn't. And it's because it's that sense of uncertainty, of being, of surrender, again, that leads you to realize what you're able to do, what you're capable of doing, what your full potential is. And that's the door we keep knocking on, but running from, because there is very little profit in me telling you that you don't need me.
Yes, absolutely. And we deal with that all the time as coaches ourselves, and there's other people in the industry, right? So, and our own pitfalls along the journey. You know, I'm not perfect and squeaky clean either, right? But you bring up something that I think is really key to not only like this conversation, but like everything we're doing with Bridge the Gap, and probably, if you were to consider it, a lot of what you're doing with Dualistic Unity as well. And you mentioned selfishness, service to self. And then the other side of the coin would be service to others, right? And Zach and I talked about this a lot. This is kind of core to the way that I think Zach and I, and maybe you guys as well, kind of view like almost all of our choices in life, right? Because free will is a big part of this existence, and like what you do with that. Those are the kind of the two directions, and finding that own balance between there. Because of course you can't be all service to others, because then you're not gonna drink water and eat food, and you're gonna die being a martyr, right? At the most extreme end, right? So there's something there, and even the way we interpret things, you can interpret the same thing as either service to self or service to others. Like Dolores Cannon, for example, which I actually have read her books. I actually quite enjoyed a lot of it. I think a lot of it becomes very like, whoa, this is really out there, right? But I think there's a lot of good things in there too. And while they're very way, she may be very much snake oil. I don't know. I've never met her. But what I do know is that I think a lot of, even if these are just fun stories and beliefs that people are attaching to that maybe aren't fully true, but maybe that's really helping those people in their particular point in time and space in their life. So maybe you can interpret that as, oh, you're selling a thing and I have the answer, and that's valid. I'm not saying that's not valid, but you could also see how that could be of service to certain people in the right way. I also want to comment on something you said, Andrew, as well, that I actually a little bit disagree with. You say that like there should not be leadership, or maybe that's not exactly what you're saying, but it's like you are moving away from the concept of following and leading, which is cool. But I actually think that is very important for learning. And to be a good follower and to be a good learning is part of being a good human, just from my personal experience. And another, I think, dynamic that is quite similar to the follower leader is teacher student. And I think, again, like, I see you guys as teachers and students. I see myself as a teacher and a student. I think that's so key for the whole journey, right? And in moments, I need to be a good follower, to really listen. And to not pretend that I, necessarily am going to be most effective alone. I agree with what you're saying, that ultimately, like, we are all one, so the answers are all within. But if we're all one, then the answers are also within other people. But we also have to have discernment. So I think it brings up a lot of different, and I see Ray maybe shaking his head, so you feel free to disagree with me. That's okay. I just think it's a different perspective, but feel free if you guys want to challenge that or to add your flavor.
All right, let's go. All right. So with the conversation of, I mean, this goes for the idea of selfishness, the follower leader dynamic. Something, we talk about a lot, a very common theme that comes up is identity and the idea of ourselves, as Ray talked about a lot in his sort of backstory and whatnot, and the recognition, the idea of yourself is never the truth of what you are. And that idea is the exact thing that holds us back from recognizing, the deeper truths about ourselves. And even in the statement, we are one, if you really recognize that, there is no we, because in oneness, there is no other. There is no other person. Right now, I'm just talking to myself.
Right.
Through all of you. And so anything, in the teacher-student dynamic, even the idea of selfishness, kind of when you recognize that you aren't just what you think you are as this individual, selfishness kind of comes full circle. So you're still being selfish when you're helping other people because you're helping yourself. And we've had an episode kind of on that, like taking back the idea of selfishness, because when you see yourself in everyone, like literally see yourself in everyone, not just through a cerebral kind of conceptual way, but you literally see it, then your entire perspective of everything shifts. And when you recognize that idea of yourself that you cling to, that is not a bad thing by any means. The ego is not a bad thing. It is very much necessary. I call it our ticket to experience this illusion of duality, but it's not the truth. So as long as you cling to the idea and reinforce the idea and do things that reinforce the perception of division, like identifying as a student or a teacher, it's going to reinforce the idea that you are something separate from anyone. And so as much as you can have qualities that are leader or student, I think when it comes to identifying as I am the leader of this community, you're cutting it off right there. You're distorting the entire message. If we were to say that we are the leaders of Dualistic Unity, we would be distorting everything we ever said. So we very much push and reinforce to everyone that it is even playing field. There is no hierarchy whatsoever. And on the student side, but that being said, we host retreats and whatnot. So it's not to say that we are the leaders of the retreat, but there are certain responsibilities that we have while being mindful of the potential dynamic that people can perceive us as. So we do everything we can to cut down any of those ideas. And then from the student point of view, like, I'm always learning for myself, but when you take on the identity again, saying I am this, it means you're not also everything else. And it's
creates
reinforcing
distortion. Yes.
Yeah, that perception of division. And so I think it's just important when it comes to identifying as anything to be mindful of the distortion that comes with taking it too far. I think identity, me being called Andrew is, not a bad thing. It's not like, an example I like to use is if no one had names, we didn't use these names that are not the reality of what we are, but just an identity that we can utilize. Everyone by you, you're in a group of people and you want to call out to your friend and you say, hey, you, everyone turns around. That's not super convenient. So the identities that we use are merely for convenience sake. They're tools to be used that makes communication easier, makes interactions easier. But as a society, we have just taken them so far that we actually believe the ideas, the identities that we cling to are the truth of what we are, as opposed to just a tool that makes that communication process easier. So there's a spectrum of recognizing that you're not what you think you are, but you can still utilize it. It's not about killing your ego. It's not about getting rid of identity. It's kind of like using it with an open hand, using it lightly, kind of taking it lightly, and being willing to kind of get caught up in the ideas, but recognizing that it's never going to be the reality of what you are. So as long as you keep that in mind, you won't experience so much distortion and suffering that comes with believing that the idea of you is the truth of what you are. But it's just important to be mindful of that.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And to jump in here, like, yeah, you made a great point. Like, selfishness cannot exist at the highest level of awareness, because it's so obvious that you are everything and you're everyone. Being selfish is also being of service to others because you are others, right? Part of why I bring this in is like you're saying, it's like the goal is not to kill the ego. Like, having a name, Andrew or Oliver or Zach or Ray, is helpful in living as a human being, right? Because we have inherent limits in this physical experience. As much as we want to, we do our best to connect to the most infinite, the most limitless aspect of God or the self or everything. It's almost like there's a certain set of limitations as well. And so it's like, that's where I find some differentiation is like what you're saying at the core is true. And I have journeyed that, I guess you could say, to verify that's true within myself. But something Zach and I think believe is very important is how can we make this process, because like you said, it's a long journey. Like, you guys have a very high level of awareness. It is very uncommon. Like, the awareness that you guys are at in that, it is very rare. I've talked to a lot of people, right? And I've been in this space. But to the greater masses, Zach and I both have a mission of wanting to help make this more digestible. But go ahead, Zach.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to posit too, and I like where you guys are shifting this conversation, but like, I've seen people in my life step into this construct of like, I am no one. I'm just all one. Right. And they lose the ability to relate to the people around them in a weird way. Like it's almost like they weren't ready in some aspect to take in that truth, that there was still some blockage in taking in that truth. And I think, I wonder if you guys have seen this in your community of this level of integration, because they're saying, well, I am everyone. For some people, like, it can almost, I even notice it can like almost deter their like healing process, because like, oh, I am my abuser. Right. And sometimes that can be a truth that like actually hinders their process in a way. Right. So what I'm like throwing some stuff out there in terms of, I've seen sometimes that this can be, you guys seem very grounded in this awareness, but is there a place where sometimes people might not be able to kind of integrate that in a healthy way within their day-to-day life, because they're just kind of like, oh, I'm just one with all, right? And as you said, we still do need an identity. So I just kind of wanted to posit that, if anyone wants to take the reins on that one.
Yeah, okay. Sure, absolutely. That's a good question. I think that it's important to recognize, as Andrew was saying, that when we talk about dualistic unity, the core insight is that you are not what you think. It's not, we are one with all, we are everyone. That's an insight that you will inevitably get to once you've surrendered enough of what you think you are. And so it's always just chipping away at what you think you are. And that's what opens up more of what you really are. And I think that to answer your question regarding trauma and eventually bridging that gap between you and your abuser, I think that's where that makes that easier, is because you work your way through unloading your own walls towards the recognition that they also had their own walls, that they also had their own suffering. And so there's a gap that gets bridged there, as opposed to just I'm them, which is all conceptual. You see, that's the whole point, right? Like saying we are one, as Andrew said, is inaccurate. It's not correct, right? There is no we, there is no one. I mean, all of that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? So when you get to a certain level of awareness, as we were saying, you start to realize that the description is not the described. And that's really all this comes down to, over and over and over again. You're not what you think, right?
So,
and that's freeing more than anything.
So sorry to cut you off, but like, so really, I think what you took away from your own journey, that the suffering was led to an over-attachment to identity, right? Like over-attachment to like narratives and stories. And the moment that we can start kind of detaching or depersonalizing us a little bit from these narratives of like, I am my suffering, I am this, and kind of let go and surrender, you found that was a thing that kind of clicked you out of your own hell, or was it, or am I
I would say that identity and suffering go hand in hand. See, my problem was that, sure, I was overcommitted to identity, but that's because identity is the way our society runs. We all think we are what we think. And it doesn't matter if you think you are your suffering or if you think that you're the best person in the world. You're still going to run into conflict with reality as a result of that narrative that you're telling yourself, because you're not a concept. You're not an idea. So suffering and identity go hand in hand. It's the reason we experience jealousy, competition, comparison, envy, greed, all of it. It all ties back to identity, all of it. And it's not to say that identity is a bad thing. It's something that we must develop. I'm a parent. I have a 15-year-old daughter. I'm aware that we have to go through these stages of recognizing that we are something that we think we are, trying to integrate with reality with everybody else who thinks that they are something, and then watching yourself as you drift away from people who think differently than you. And so you have to question that identity in order to bridge the gap and find empathy and all of that. But if you don't question your identity, you always create conflict. It doesn't matter. This is part of the developmental process. We talk about this often in terms of Jane Levenger's stages of ego development, which she came out with in the 50s. But basically, the ego development stages are the process of surrendering that idea of yourself, period. Not the good or the bad, period. And in doing so, coming back to reality, coming back to what is actually real, which is never the fiction of you. It's always this idea that gets in the way of us actually being with other people, right? Which is why in a conversation, as soon as you're thinking about yourself, you've lost the timer.
Andrew, anything the kind of, any thoughts coming up with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just that with the conversation of going back to some of your points, Zach and Oliver, that the idea of people getting caught up in sort of like, oh, I am one, I am everything. Like we've spoken with some people who are of that belief system, because that's really what it is. It's just another belief system. If you're not, it's another egotistical mentality, believing, oh, I am this, because it's not a recognition. And so I do my best to reinforce people not to believe that we're one, not to believe in unity. As Ray said, inevitably through the continued process of questioning, of letting go of all of the ideas that you think you are, that cut you off from what is here and now, because any idea isn't the reality of it here and now. As Ray said, the description is not the described ever. And so when you believe in unity, when you believe that you are one with everything, you're still very much holding on to the idea of yourself. Like, I have recognized that we are one, and therefore that puts me up here, and you have not recognized this yet, and therefore you are down here. And it still is this comparison, sort of hierarchical mentality. And so it's not about believing in anything. Inevitably, it's a recognition that you come to through understanding that idea of yourself, that idea that sort of cuts you off from the rest of reality. Those walls that come with identity may not exist to the degree that you think. As those walls come down, there isn't division between you and reality anymore. What's left? All that's left is unity. If there is no more division, at least recognizing there is no actual division, there is still very much the perception of division, but the reality is that there is none, then there are no walls. So it's not even one, because that implies that there's a boundary to it. So even saying that it's one isn't it. And any time, as we've kind of been saying, the words, when people say like, oh, these might not be the right words, there are no right words. If we can understand that when we're having a conversation, then it allows for the conversation to actually be had and things to be understood. Granted, there are words that maybe have a little bit less distortion in them, a little bit less conceptual, but there is no objectively truthful words. Words and language are always inherently dualistic. So when we're having these conversations, that's why I said before, insights and understanding things are very much a two-way street. So that's why I don't take credit for anything that I say. If I help someone, it's like I can say one thing and it helps someone and pisses someone else off. Like, it's not on me, it's about them and their state. So if it helps them, that's their doing. That's their ability to understand what I'm saying. But it's a two-way street, the communicator and the communicated. So it's very important, but recognizing that, the words, the pointers that we use are only ever pointers, and they're never the reality of what they are, kind of allows for the conversation to actually flow when everyone recognizes that, at the very least. So it's very important as well.
I'd like to add something quickly if you guys don't mind.
Go, Ray.
In Oliver, you had said something about wanting to make this more digestible. And this very much goes to the point that we're trying to make, because I spent years, and this was originally my mission after I quote unquote woke up, was I'm going to find a syntax. I'm going to find a way that I can communicate this to anyone, regardless of their situation or their belief or how they identify. I'm going to find a way. And I spent a lot of years burning a lot of bridges and pissing a lot of people off trying to develop that way. And I just want to let you know, it's not about what you say. It really is about who you are, and who you are comes across in what you say. It also allows you to be informed by everyone else. So the more you abandon your idea of yourself, the more you are aligning with everyone else, because they're all you, right? And that's when the words are just there. The words just come to you, and it may not resonate with everybody, but it's not supposed to. It will resonate with those who want it to at that time. And so all we're doing is throwing seeds. But the important part is that you're the foundation of those seeds. The quality of those seeds is dictated by how much you're thinking about yourself. So the more you relax, the better the seeds. And that's it. That's really all it is in terms of communicating this. It's embodying it. It's not about being clever about the message. It's not about, finding the perfect way to put it. It really is just living it. And then letting people see it if they want to. You don't chase them. You can't teach being, right? Because then you're not being.
I like that actually quite a bit. And specifically what you said that really resonated was how the more you abandon your self-identity, the more you'll be able to connect with everybody else, because you're less individual, which is, you could say, a form of separation. Yeah. And,
exactly.
So like as a social anxiety coach, identity, right? I say to my clients very often what you just said about what it's not really the words that you say. It's the energy. It's the intention. It's who you are at the core. Absolutely. And I think that's a great reminder of that. So thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you. I appreciate both of you and what you're doing here. It's really important that we continue this conversation. And I think that's why Andrew and I don't take credit and don't consider ourselves to be leaders, because we want everybody who ever hears this conversation to go, I can do this. This is for me, and make it theirs. And at least then if Andrew and I disappear off the face of the planet, if you disappear off the face of the planet, it won't matter a damn thing, because they're still doing it with the same enthusiasm, because it's on them.
Yes, I'm all for that. And that's something that I, even in my work, I try to do frequently, is to be able to pass along the tools that I have used that have worked for me, in the hopes that they will not need me, right? Because I think that this, from my perspective, one of the biggest problems of society is what I think Andrew identified a few times, is the illusion, the lie of a hierarchy. And I think the way it's most commonly related is in the form of what we call social status, which to me is, I used to be so bought into that in my past self, and that just the amount of suffering that caused was just really intense. And I see it so often people never feeling at peace because of that infinite, the realm of hungry ghosts, that infinite chase. And something I am frequently in my work and just in the way that I operate, I try to dismantle or disintegrate those lies because it's bullshit. It's there to keep us trapped and to keep us small. And I'm sure you guys have a lot to say on that, Zach, as well. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of interesting ways we can take this too, because like, how much do we still need a self? How much do we actually need an identity, right? Because if you're right, and I think like you even brought up the stages of healthy ego development, like, and Andrew said this, it's not about killing the ego. And this is the thing that I see in the spiritual spaces that I think kind of frustrates with me, because I think that can lead to like a fracturing of the psyche, right? Like I think you need a concept of self. It's just a healthy concept of self. And the beingness, thank you. Yeah, Ray's giving me your flowers. I feel so good right now. My ego's taking this in very, very nicely, right? Because this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to bridge the gap. And it's really tough because a lot of these spiritual concepts you're bringing up transcend language, right? So there's noise in my background, but transcend, who gives a fuck, right? It's all whatever. So it transcends language. And so this is why I think Jesus used metaphors and parables to get a lot of these concepts in. And now we're trying to use language to describe a state that is beyond language. And this is where the bridging the gap occurs of like, because everyone's like, oh, oneness. I'm not even my name, right? And then it's like, no, you're still Sharon to an extent. Like, you need to let go of some over identifications. And so for me, what I've seen, it's really important, is how do we come back to bridging the gap with a healthy construct of self that is not overly attached to something outside of you, where we're not like, I am Zach and I am a white dude who went to law school. Like, I think that is what creates the suffering, right? Would you agree with that? I think we're just trying to bridge the gap between our conceptual understandings and perspectives, because I think you still need an identity. It's just society leads us in a way to develop the negative aspect of that identity: comparison, judgment, scarcity, like I need this, right? And I think for us, it's not leading people, but as you said, showing people a way to question over and over and over again to a point where they can let go of the unhealthy aspects of the ego. Is that, am I doing a good job of kind of surmising a little bit of some of what?
I think so. Yeah. I think you're doing a great job. I'm just going to weigh in quickly. I'm going to pass it back to Andrew. But see, the whole thing is that in working on myself and letting go of who I think I am, I come to the realization that I can be anything I want to be, but it's never what I am. And so it's a tool rather than a prison. But in knowing it's a tool and not a prison, that it's not actually the truth, that I am, in fact, the awareness of reality itself, that I am my own existence. That means that everything that I do with everybody else changes. And this is something I've said to Andrew. Like, I spent 10 years not talking about all of this deeper conceptual stuff because it was all about applying it to myself. I actually shut down a YouTube channel in 2006 that was doing quite well because people started looking at me as a teacher. It made me uncomfortable. And it's because if that's happening, then there's some distortion in the message that's coming across. And it was because it was in me. I was still trying to save the world. I was still trying to fix something. And it wasn't until I came to peace that everything I did changed the world, because I wasn't trying to. So everybody I talk to gets my undivided attention. They get all of me while I'm with them because I'm there completely. I don't have any ulterior motives or anything else. And that changes things for them. It allows them to feel a little bit more free. And so it's not about doing anything in terms of convincing them or anything else. It's about relaxing and allowing other people to feel like they're safe enough to relax themselves. And in that's unity unfolding. That's the reality of unity, as opposed to the concept, which sounds, all well and good, but doesn't actually go anywhere, because this is why we say it's dualistic unity. You must have duality to have an experience, but it's the overcommitment to that duality that ends up causing all the distortion. That's it. Keep that in mind. You're good to go. You be whatever you want to be. Just don't get caught in it.
Can I, before Andrew comes in, so I just want to say for our viewers, because I love that line. If we could imprint a tagline for what we got, where we got to this episode, it is the overcommitment to duality. We're having an experience of separateness, but it's the overcommitment and the over attachment to that separateness that we're trying to work through.
Yeah. Yeah. It's believing that the division that we perceive is the truth, what it is, which reinforces our idea of ourself as something inherently separate from reality. So if you can just recognize that you're here now, and that's more or less the extent of you. It's not to say that you haven't experienced other things in your life, but typically that whole idea of yourself is rooted in the past. You know, someone has an experience, say they tried practicing an instrument or something when they were younger, picked up a guitar and they didn't do very well. They just couldn't get it. And so they identify as being bad at guitar. Then even though they have the potential to get really good at guitar, because they've settled upon that as this is one of my truths. This is a truth of me. This is something about me that is unquestionable. I'm bad at guitar. They'll never have the opportunity to experience what it may be like to be good at guitar. And we cling throughout our lives. We have so many different experiences. Say a lot of times people with traumatic experiences, they go through something where they do really poorly at something, and it kind of plagues them for the rest of their life because that has now become sort of identity with them. And so throughout our lives, especially through childhood and our teenage years, it's like all of the experiences that we have, we experience a little bit of it. We're like, okay, so I'm this. Okay, so I'm this. As we're building that idea of ourself, it's like we have a backpack on from birth and we're just like tossing things in the backpack. And over time, it weighs us down. Things get harder. Being in reality here and now and just being sort of the reality of our infinite potential, being free to do or experience whatever we want is held back by that, all of the identities, that heavy backpack that we now have. By the time we're 20, 25, 30, we're kind of solidified in this idea. And so we've created this nice prison for ourselves with the idea of ourself that we believe to be the truth. And even though the door is open, it's comfortable. We know it. We know we're certain about it. I am this. I am not that. I am this. I am not that. I am this. So it hinders our growth. You know, if you're being willing to grow, you need to be willing to let go of all the things that you believe to be true about you. You have to be willing to, when you try something new, probably fail a bunch before you get even reasonably good at it. But if every time you fail or do poorly on something, you think it means something about the reality of you, it's going to make it really difficult to try anything new, to work on things, to grow, to change, to shift. And so by the time we're 20, 30 years old, we have a pretty solidified idea of ourselves. You know, I'm an American, I'm a liberal, I like this sports team, I like this, I like that, I like this. And so as we attach to that, we build all these walls and we create a lot of distortion between ourselves and the flow of reality. And it's something that we now have to defend as someone comes around and we see someone else as having a different identity. It's like, okay, I either have to avoid you or change your mind, as opposed to just being able to have a conversation with them. And as you let go, as you recognize that, okay, there was some benefit to building that identity, to putting things in the backpack, those stages of ego development, we're at a stage now across humanity where it's basically like we just fill the backpack and then it's like, all right, here we go on this journey, fucking heavy as shit, but I'm going to keep chugging along, as opposed to recognizing the next stage is dropping the backpack and recognizing that, okay, I can utilize this name, I can utilize this perception of division, but all of those things that I thought were true about me aren't actually true. And so coming back to the reality of what is here and now, looking around, understanding that those thoughts and those ideas you perceive yourself to be are never, ever going to be the truth of what you are, allows you to experience reality freely, allows you to express your infinite potential, to try new things, to grow. And so there's a ton of importance to understanding that idea and that identity isn't the truth, despite there still being the perception of division, and being able to utilize it in the moment for the tool that it is, without attaching to all of the weights that have accumulated throughout your past.
Yeah, and I think for everybody, especially at the start, beginning to even look behind your shoulder and see, oh, I've got a backpack on, is fucking terrifying. And, you know, a lot of people feel like there's baggage about even having baggage, you know? And I'm curious to see what you guys have to say about for people who are kind of maybe new to that journey, because I think that's a lot of people. who might be tuning in. Just perspectives, tools, things like that, that could be very actionable, very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll weigh in on this quickly. Basically, I think it's really important to not judge your progress. Don't judge your progress because you don't understand how well you're doing. You're just looking at yourself through the filter of who you think you are. And that's a habit more than anything. The perspective of yourself that you've developed is habitual. It's built over time, day after day, moment after moment, and you don't recognize how thick that habit is, but it has infinite layers. And so don't judge your progress. That's the biggest thing, in my opinion. As you go through your day to day and you have a moment where, say, and I use this example a lot because this was my moment for me, say you're in line at the restaurant and you're waiting for the next person in front of you and you're kind of getting impatient, and then you recognize, all right, this person's got a life and maybe I don't need to get there. Oh, and you relax a little bit instead of surrendering to that need to have control. Pat yourself on the back. That was a victory. Congratulate yourself for those little victories, because that's what's going to give you the enthusiasm to have more victories along the way. But nobody's going to recognize that you do that. Nobody's going to come up to you and go, hey, I saw how you put that little petty problem down. Nobody's going to have the wherewithal to do that because they're dealing with their own petty problems. And so just recognize that you are doing better than you think. I promise you that you are doing better than you think. And that all you're really waiting for is to oscillate in and out of moments of clarity. Because in those moments of clarity, and you may remember a few, everything makes sense. But until you're there, nothing makes sense. And you start to think, God, am I not doing this right? Don't worry about it. Wait for the moment of clarity. It will all come together and you go, okay, this seems appropriate. Now I can do something with it. But if you're judging your progress, remember, it's a habit. You're not what you think you are.
Yeah, and to go off that, I think another important thing to recognize, especially early on, if you're dealing with a lot of those weights, a lot of that baggage from your past that are holding you back from doing a lot of things that you want to do. So you have big aspiring to achieve big things in your life. Don't get so worked up about doing that end goal too quickly. Like if you say, for example, have social anxiety and it's pretty crippling and you have a tough time even going outside of your house, but deep down, you know that one day you want to have a podcast or be a great public speaker or whatever it may be. Like thinking that you're just going to go there without having any progress in between is there's a 0% chance of that. Like that doesn't happen. So understanding that if you're having a tough time just interacting with people, like just leaving your house and going on a walk and being in public for a little bit, like that's a victory right there. Just little steps along the way. Because as you see that you can do a little bit more than you did today, go a tiny bit further. Maybe the next day you go to a more crowded area. You still don't say something, or if you're afraid of going to a party, you just show up to the party, do a lap and leave in 5 minutes. And like, that's it. And that's your day. Instead of thinking that you have to go around and, be the life of the party immediately, because through that step, you'll see, oh, okay, I can do that. I can, and, even if it's not the next day, maybe it's 3 weeks later, you go a little bit further. And then 3 weeks later, you're fucking petrified and you don't leave your house again. And the reality is that you still, those last 2 times you went out, that was still progress, as Ray said. And so it's important to recognize that, any step that you take beyond where you're at is incredible. That's amazing. It's not about going to the end of the goal you want to achieve in life. There's going to be a massive process to getting there, but it's also cumulative and exponential. So even when you feel like, you took 3 steps forward and then you took 2 steps back, you're still a step ahead of where you were. And so if you get caught up though, in every time you take a tiny step back or go back to some of those old habits that are very habitual, their habits can be very tough to break. They kind of are a thing that we cling to for some sense of certainty and safety in this reality. So understanding that you also, when you start judging yourself for taking a step back, and then you recognize that you're judging yourself, like you don't have to judge yourself for judging yourself. You get caught up in judgments, you can recognize it, be like, oh, I'm judging myself again. And you don't have to take it so seriously, because getting caught up in judging yourself for judging yourself for judging yourself is just going to get you back in that same mentality that you started with. So even if you take a step back, judge yourself for judging yourself, then you can leave it. Then if you can stop there, that's progress right there. Anytime you recognize what you're doing to yourself, what you're clinging to, what you're reinforcing, and you catch it, like that's a huge win right there. So it's not about, going to the end of everything you want to do in your life and everything you want to accomplish. It's just about taking one little step further, or even beyond that, even beyond doing anything public or physical, just being willing to question something you cling to, something you think that you are. If you're like, maybe I'm not that, but I think I am. Like even that subtle, just questioning, that's dropping a seed in there. That's making a shift in your mentality, in your reality. So baby steps is important, as they say in What About Bob, which is a great one if you haven't checked it out.
So I like what you're saying, and as we like kind of, I think we're winding down in terms of like this whole notion. We started off with this big concept, right, of the interconnectedness of being and everything, and now we're bridging the gap, and we're getting to this notion of, well, we really judge ourselves a lot. We put meaning to every little experience, right? We are programmed to say my value, my worth is attaining this big podcast and this, right? And it's all about the end goal. But there's a process there. And to almost fall in love with the process, not overly shame ourselves for the mistakes we make, whatever. And that's a skill that needs to be developed. Like we're programmed largely from our society, Western society, to like not know how to not shame ourselves, to not appreciate the small steps in the process. And Andrew, I even want to bring up this whole concept. You talked about the backpack, and we're carrying the past around like a backpack, and all these identities like a backpack. And I think one of the things we're working to help people understand is you might not be able to rid yourself of the whole backpack in a day. That literally it is like going in the backpack. This is my coaching work. Like I'm like, dude, it's gonna take a fucking long time. Your brain was wired like this for 20 to 30 years. Like there's all these neural connections made. Let's take out one little trinket of the backpack, see it, reframe it, and so it's a path of becoming that we have to normalize, that this takes fucking time. All right, would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. I would also say value that time. And I say that as you approach the farther end of letting yourself go, you're actually going to start to look back at all of your petty squabbles and complaints with a bit of nostalgia. You'll actually start to go, I think I'm going to develop a pet peeve just for the sake of laughing at it. And it really does become more of a tool. So enjoy the process while you can. And I know that's not easy depending where you are on it, but just remember, it's not what you think, and you will find that you are more capable than you ever could have imagined.
Yeah. And as you said, it takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. And assuming that it is, or thinking that it is, it's only going to make it significantly more difficult. It's like that idea of it not taking time is going to be like a fucking mudslide that you're always crawling up. When you recognize that it's going to take time, it kind of flattens out the surface and turns it into pavement, makes it a little easier to walk along. So yeah, certainly don't think that you're going to drop the backpack overnight. Any little thing you can take off out of the backpack or peel back about, that super layered idea of yourself that you have is going to be some semblance of progress. And as I said before, it's cumulative and it's exponential as you start getting used to questioning yourself, as you become used to existing in that state of uncertainty and that discomfort that comes with uncertainty initially, especially, and you become a little bit more comfortable with that discomfort, comfortable with, not really knowing where you're going or what's going to happen tomorrow, and being okay with that. Like that's really what it's all about, becoming okay with the reality of uncertainty, because so many of us do everything we possibly can to try and avoid the uncertainty, be it about ourselves, about reality, about the way we think other people are. You're always uncertain, but we try and place all of these things on top of that uncertainty to make us more comfortable. And all it does is take us further from the freedom that's available when we relax finally into the reality of uncertainty.
Oliver, you want to hit this or you want me?
Yeah. I mean, I'm loving everything I'm hearing. I feel very blessed to be in this conversation with three just really just beautiful souls, beautiful spirits, and sharing such wisdom. It's just a pleasure. And yeah, like there's, I found along my journey of my, backpack, which had many rocks in it, men of many kinds, that at a certain point, I got kind of familiar with the process of, taking the trinkets out. And I almost started to love it, as weird as that sounds. I almost started to enjoy it, even though it was like it's painful stuff. You can get to the point where it doesn't feel just like, oh, I gotta do another thing. You can learn to love the release of that. Not only knowing that things will get better and you will feel better, but that's just kind of, it just is what it is. That's what reality, life, the universe is presenting to you. And you can either learn to resist it or learn to flow with it. And even pain, I find when I'm flowing with my pain, it's not really that uncomfortable. It's almost weird. It can almost be euphoric at times. It sounds masochistic, but I think it can be true, but I am definitely not perfect. I still resist plenty in my life. And I think, and I love Ray and Andrew, like, I love how you guys make it such an importance to when you speak and connect with your audience to frequently mirror that, like, guys, we are not different. Like, you can do what I'm doing. Like, you have all of the power. We're, same potential. And, I feel that really applies with the backpack, It's like, ultimately you have the power to take the stones out. And ultimately, I don't really think other people can take your trinkets out. I really don't think so. I don't believe so at all. Maybe that's just my distorted belief, but I think that can be daunting for people, because then the scary word responsibility comes up. And for a lot of people, that is scary because they were programmed from an early age that responsibility meant like you have to do like chores, and chores are bad, and like, things like that. There's just negative programming around it. But I think it's important to reframe that responsibility as, like, number one, the fact that it's your ability to respond, but also like the power is with you. I think a lot of people feel very powerless, very hopeless and helpless in the society, but really the power is inside of you. So that's what I have to share on that.
Absolutely. I just want to add very quickly that I think the biggest problem with responsibility is that we tend to misinterpret it as fault.
Yes.
Somehow we've done something wrong. And so on that note, you're right. The process of changing your perception, of looking at it from a different way, of giving yourself a little bit of leeway so you can understand where you were coming from when you made that decision, rather than looking back with your newfound clarity and going, oh, I should have done that differently. You're willing to look at it and go, right, but I couldn't have, because I didn't have this insight when I made that decision. And so you have a little bit more empathy for yourself, but it is a difficult process. And just to take a moment, if there is anything, or if there is any situation wherein you will see the relationship that Andrew and I have with our audience, it's at the retreat. Because at the retreat, people do their own work. Like, we say it's a retreat, but anybody who goes to the retreat will tell you there's work involved. And it's because you're relaxing. You're trying to be vulnerable around a bunch of other people, but they're all trying to be vulnerable too. And so they're all very understanding about where you're coming from. As somebody said at the retreat, nobody's tolerating anybody. There was no such thing as tolerance, just empathy and understanding. And so it allowed everybody to continue to relax and relax and relax. And these retreats are 9 days long. And so by day 4, day 5, everybody's basically aware of the fact that they're all connected. And they've done so organically through just shedding more of themselves. And occasionally, Andrew and I just come over and say, hey, how's it going? Want to take a walk? Right? And they can reflect for a little bit, and then we all just come back together. But that's where you see that Andrew and I aren't teaching anything. We're just bobbing around in our own existence, serving a purpose wherever we are, whatever that purpose might be. And we don't know, because if we had an idea, that would throw it off. Right? And so we're always just kind of doing our best to be ourselves and see what happens next. And at the retreat, it's almost magical to watch how well everybody works together when you stop making it about you, and they're all doing the same thing. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So we loved having, oh, sorry, Andrew. No, go on.
Just real quick regarding the responsibility, kind of along Oliver's point that no one's ever going to force you to let go of your suffering. No one's ever going to force you to change necessarily. And no one's going to do it for you. No one can do it for you. It's impossible for anyone else to take those rocks out of your backpack, and no one's going to force you to take any rocks out. People can try and do their best to help you to recognize that maybe the rocks are holding you back. But if you're not in a state of clarity enough to recognize it yourself, you're not going to hear them at all. And I think Ray and I both have said a few times that if we had been talking to our younger selves when we were going through, the degree of hell that each of us were going through, that we wouldn't have heard what we were saying in this mentality, because the person has to, as Jesus said, have those ears to hear. And no one's ever going to force you to change or shift or let go of anything. No one can do it for you. So it really does come down to you.
It comes back to you. And I think, we brought up Dolores Cannon earlier, and to even tie back to that real quickly, of like, when we're putting our power in someone else's hands, like you guys are just very adamant, like we are not the leaders. There is no hierarchy, because as we've seen with organized religion, that has tended to be the problem, right? Of people putting themselves in this artificial hierarchy and say, I have a bigger connection to God because I wear the hat, right? And it's like,
the bigger the hat, the better the connection. It's like an antenna.
Yeah. Right. And it's like, well, no. Right. And I think that's what I think as we're moving into this different point in time and space, we're trying to now rid ourselves of that artificial hierarchy. Right. So because that leaves up the potentials for abuse and selfishness to cut for us now. I think the next paradigm of people who, I know you don't like the word teaching, but just sharing, we'll use the word sharing spiritual perspectives and principles, right? It's of like, please, oh my fucking God, you guys can do it too. Like here is a way, see if it resonates. And if it doesn't, then it's okay. Right. Like there is no, hey, you didn't do this right. Like this isn't about, baseball coaching, basketball coaching of like, you didn't fucking do beingness enough. Right. Like it is literally just, it is coming back and teaching people how to come back to self. Right. And showing, and us, I think, Ray, you have really, I don't want to say prototypical, but like you have a story that I've seen of people who are in the space who are very well respected, of suffering and going through the dark night of the soul. But I think what you really do is you're relaying your learnings along that path. And if it resonates for someone, great. If it doesn't, I ain't no guru. Kumbaya to you. Right. And I think this is where this field ultimately, when we talk about bridging the gap, I see a lot of people coming in who are immensely suffering. They start stepping into a little bit higher states of awareness because suffering can lend us to that. But then how do we start mitigating the potential for abuse along that? Because I see that in the sphere, in the self-improvement sphere. And I think we can all say we're kind of all in that. And I think it's, once again, to the listeners, see if the person is bringing the power back to you. That's what Andrew and Ray, I think, are really emphasizing, to bring the power back to you. When someone starts pedestalizing themselves, that might be a thing of like, hi, right? And so I just want to say, does that resonate with you guys too?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think it's important to be very mindful of anyone telling you the right way to live, what you should be doing. Anytime anyone says you should do this, like, be very careful, or you shouldn't do that. Like those two words, shouldn't. Like those are, if I have least favorite words, it's probably those. And they're very much for myself. I'm talking about my own experience, thinking, internally that I should be doing this, because that's where suffering lies. The gap between where you're at and where you think you should be, what you're feeling and what you think you should be feeling, what you're going through in your life and what you think you should be going through in your life, or the idea that you should be going through something else and you shouldn't be going through what you're going through. Like all of those, it's like, you're always where you're at. You're always feeling what you're feeling. So if you can become not complacent with where you're at, but at least accept it for what it is, and understand that in order to change anything, you have to first accept that you're going through the thing that you want to change to begin with. So acceptance is always going to be that first step. But as long as you think you shouldn't be where you're at, it's not actually going to change anything. It's just going to reinforce the suffering. It's a sort of mental hamster wheel. Like, oh, I wish I wasn't here. I shouldn't be here. But it doesn't actually enact any change. Change happens through the acceptance of where you're at. And through that acceptance, that letting go of the resistance that comes with all of the shoulds and all of the ideas that I wish I was somewhere else, clarity arises when there isn't so much resistance to the place that you're at. And then you can see all the options that were always there that you were blind to because of your resistance to the reality. of where you were. So very important to let go of those words. And so anyone who comes around telling you that you should do this, you shouldn't do that, follow me, do this, don't do that, this is the right way to live, this is the wrong way to live, just be careful. Those are some red flags that are always coming up to me if someone starts using a lot of words and phrases like that.
Yeah, I think we definitely very much agree with that. And something that I learned from my first life coaching teacher, she told us you gotta stop shooting all over yourself. You're shooting on yourself, right? And it was hilarious at the time. And just that little funny statement helped me to integrate that piece of wisdom you just shared. So I wanted to share that funny little blurb.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Don't go shitting all over the place, for sure.
And one more thing before I forget. I wanted to add, for people who find themselves maybe as in some sort of role of influence, I would call that leadership. Maybe we hate that word here. That's okay. But if you want to share something, and this is something I literally have it on my phone screen. You probably can't see it, but it's basically like, instead of here's what you should do, it's here's what I did. And I think I sometimes forget that because I'm just trying to be helpful, but I agree with you. I don't like the should at all. But when you just share from your own experience, it's hard to go wrong because that's true for you. And you're not telling other people they need to or not, but you're still sharing maybe the tools and the insights that they can still draw from. And I think it prevents any guard from getting put up too. So it's just more effective. But that's all I had to say. Thank you.
I agree. I wanted to add one more thing in terms of watching for the snake oil, because the thing about snake oil is that it has that ounce of truth. There's always that little bit of truth, and that's what draws you in. And so if you can learn how to see the truth and discard the snake oil, then even snake oil is useful to you, right? But it really is understanding where that snake oil comes from. And to me, it's always this temptation to add something to what you are, as Andrew was saying earlier, whether it's a narrative that makes you special, whether it's a story that makes you more important than you would be otherwise. And it's always the cornerstone of good snake oil. You just need this, right?
You're a star seed. You're an indigo child.
Yeah. Exactly. So
you're the
to
one.
me, the biggest way or the best way to avoid that is to recognize that the less you resist what you already are, the more you will realize how much that is. And anybody who is trying to add something to that is getting you farther away from your potential. That's it. All you have to do is be what you already are. And that's the paradox that gets us. Like, how do I do that? You're already doing it. You don't have to ask how.
And that's the going from the being a human doer to a human being. I love that. And then at the most rudimentary, it's a human having, but that's another conversation. But yeah, I think that's a really good insight.
All right, so I think it's time to fully wrap up the episode. We don't want to keep you guys here too long, so thank you. But thank you for joining us, guys. And like I said, I think we did a good job of taking these what seem like very heightened concepts to some, right? I know you guys have your own community, but the people probably listening to us, they're probably like, what? Wait. I think we had a good job of bridging the gap and helping people understand that the perspective that you guys are utilizing and teaching, I'm just going to say it, can really be beneficial in terms of understanding that, like, we become overly attached to the dualistic nature, the either or, the us versus them. And if we can slowly begin to detach, slowly begin to take presence within the day-to-day, a lot of the suffering that we kind of bring to our own accord dissolves. So Oliver, I'll lend it to you to kind of sign us off. And once again, Andrew, Ray, thank you for coming on. And it was a pleasure to meet both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, before we wrap, I want you guys the opportunity, if there's anything Ray and Andrew, you guys want to shout out or promote or just share as a closing remarks or anything, please do.
First of all, thank you guys for having us on. As we've said a number of times, we just fucking love the conversation. That's why we do it now full time for our jobs with the podcast and group chats and, all the stuff through the Dualistic Unity community that is, we're as much a part of as anyone else. Not that we're leading anything or doing any of that sort of thing, but we really enjoy it. And so we very much appreciate any opportunity that we have to weigh things together, as Krishnamurti always said. But in terms of finding us, obviously Dualistic Unity podcast, check that out, dualisticunity.com. You can find everything about everything that we're doing there. For me personally, it's not Andrew Murnane at Instagram and TikTok. And yeah, that's pretty much it for me, but really enjoyed this conversation, guys, and looking forward to chatting with you again at some point soon, I'm sure.
I'd like to just take a moment to give a shout out to your listener, honestly, because we talk about all this stuff and we do so after going through our own journeys and doing the best we can to try and communicate those journeys, but those journeys were the value. And it may not feel like it right now because you're going through stuff, and it may feel like it's hard and that you're backsliding as you're crawling uphill through mud. And I just want to say, of course it does. Of course it does, because the world is working against you without even realizing it. The world is so lost in identity and confusion and competition and comparison that it doesn't even see you and how much work you're doing to survive and exist and be whatever it is you are. And so I just want to say, well done. Other people may not recognize it, but all of us here, we absolutely do. You are creating ripple after ripple after ripple just by virtue of your willingness to change. There's nothing else you need to do. And it inspires us. It's the reason I do what I do. So thank you for listening to this and being here with us. And we do hope to see you at the Dualistic Unity community sometime.
Yeah, go check it out, guys. And we love you, the viewers, of course. It's all love. And congrats on quitting jobs. I hear that was pretty recent. That's freaking awesome. I know I know the feeling. It's quite a journey. So congrats, guys. That's awesome. And yeah, thank you guys so much for coming on the pod, on the show. Seems like Zach wants to share something. Go for it, man.
Yeah, 2 to 3 years ago, I quit my job to go do this as a career. And oh my fucking God, was it scary for a little bit. So, I just literally followed the flow. It's really like, it's like the skills I developed on the path allowed me to let go and then learn how to embrace this as a career. So just want to offer you guys all the graciousness and stuff on this journey. And love having you on.
Yeah. And I remember stepping out of that Amazon warehouse for the last time, feeling like, God, thank God that's done, man. God. All right. Well, anyways, guys, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's not even words to describe how grateful I am. You guys are freaking amazing. I love you. Thank you for being you, exactly how you are. And again, I mirror that to Zach as well, and myself and the viewer and everybody. So thanks, guys. And yeah, we'll chat soon. Bye.